Just an FYI, like I can see the screen, but I haven't got my specs on, and I've taken them off because I'm by the window. So if you do ask a question, I can see it, but I will be like this. Um, so I'm Johannes Evans. My pronouns are he, him. I broadly write romance and erotica and horror, as well as like a bit of Gothic horror. But I also do a lot of like film analysis, which is why I get really into stuff like Crimson Peak. So I always love opportunities to delve into this film. I was saying recently, having rewatched it a few times the past few weeks, it's one of those films where it's so carefully thought out and put together in the way that a lot of like literature I read from 200 years ago is. And it's refreshing compared to like a lot of like modern horror that isn't necessarily doesn't feel thought out in the same way because a team of people are working on it. Whereas this is something that had like an artistic vision from the start, and that comes across. So Crimson Peak, if you're not familiar with it, is a 2015 Gothic romance written by Guillermo del Toro and Matthew Robbins and directed by del Toro. It is in line with a lot of del Toro's work in that it's beautifully costumed, beautifully lit. The setting is glorious. It's wonderfully paced. And the thing is that like I got frustrated quite a lot when it came out, and I still get frustrated with the way it's tagged now because people tag it as a horror when it is a Gothic romance. And the thing is that like one of the wonders I think of Gothic romance, as somebody who's very interested in power dynamics, especially for like different marginalized groups, whether that's in keeping with delving into misogyny and like gender roles in a patriarchal system, whether it's looking at race and the ways in which certain people are racialized, whether it's looking at disability and chronic illness. Gothic romance delves into all these themes so well in the way that most of the Gothic does. So I would say that like for the Gothic in general, it's all about big feelings. Big feelings that we can't express because the society that we live in, the contemporary society, when we look at early Victorian and then as we come into the Edwardian area where Crimson Peak is set, we're having big feelings that we can't express explicitly and that we can only express in certain appropriate settings and with only appropriate people. Especially when we're looking at family dynamics, when we're looking at power dynamics within the workplace, within class divisions, when we're looking at roles within the household, especially between like servants and staff versus like members of the household, but also when we're looking at like gender and like division of appropriate emotion and roles within the household, where you can show certain feelings, you have to show those feelings appropriately, and you have to show them with appropriate decorum. So much of this is about control and like perceived control of your person. One thing that I think makes exploration of gender so interesting when we examine the Gothic is the extent to which certain emotions are acceptable, but only if they're done to an acceptable degree. And if you go over those, immediately you're gossiped about, and immediately the risks and the potential consequences go up and up and up, right? If you're the patriarch of a household, if you're a young gentleman who's looking for marriage, if you're a workman, all of these things can affect like your employment or your social mobility and your ability to gain a wife, to control your household. If you're a woman, or if you're perceived as a woman, suddenly the consequences go up from not just not being able to find a husband or not being able to keep work and keep employment, but they go up to potentially being trapped in your home, trapped in a home, trapped in certain spaces, or then, you know, being sent to the madhouse effectively and being used to make wigs from. Crimson Peak is an interesting film because one of the things that's like explicitly delved into within it is the difference initially between English Moors and American Moors. So when we look at the film, we're looking at so it's Mia Wasikowska, Tom Hiddleston, and Jessica Chastain are like the main cast. We start off with Edith Sharp, who Edith Cushing, who we know is writing a short story. And the opening part of the film, once we move on from the initial ghost story, is her speaking with a potential editor. And immediately he says, oh, it's a ghost story. And he says it in the most dismissive manner because she's a woman. Because a ghost story from a woman is immediately something to be dismissed. Because women and their feelings and the frivolity of these womanly feelings about the dead and silly little things like ghosts. Whereas, you know, when a man does it, it's a metaphor. And she's even saying it's a metaphor and being immediately dismissed, right? A thing that I really love about this film is you see her father, Carter Cushing, Jim Beaver, giving her a pen. He's giving her what we would see like often as like a phallic representation, which for him in this film, especially because like they're having a conversation about, she said, the editor tells her to put romance in the story, and she says, I don't want to put romance in the story. It's about something more than that. And he says, well, even women fall in love. And she goes, I'm busy. He gives her a pen, and that phallic representation is effectively like him giving her permission to follow a trade. He's giving her this sort of like phallic representation and sort of like giving her permission to be more than a woman in the society around them, right? As her father, as the patriarch, and also as someone from whom she stands to inherit a large and sprawling business because she's his only daughter. He doesn't have a son. She is his firstborn. And implicitly, because they're in America, there's an idea that she will have more freedom because while she is a woman, he gets to decide that for her. He gets to decide to give her more power because they're not in England. And when he gives her this gift of a pen, she immediately says, I don't want it. She doesn't even say thank you. She says, I need a typewriter. I need a machine to disguise my gender. It's not enough that he's implicitly giving her permission with like this future idea that she'll be able to pursue more power as like the head of this business later on. That's not enough. In the meantime, she needs to disguise her gender in order to pursue her craft and in order for her craft to be taken anything like seriously. And then not long after this, she meets Thomas Sharp, who she initially dismisses as a parasite, coming from England, and because he is a parasite, as somebody who holds a title, and obviously is literally a parasite, we sort of like find out later on. But also like she becomes wooed by him. And then we see, I think Carter Cushing's like anxiety about this is in part because like he knows that as soon as she becomes married, her power is going to be subsumed by the husband that now has power over her rather than her father. He can choose not to wield that power over her, and he doesn't trust a husband to do the same, especially one that's obviously a fortune hunter. It's interesting because like I did write about Crimson Peak. I published an essay last night that sort of like delves into this a bit more than I will be here. But like in this film, we see Edith's character reaching for the typewriter rather than a pen, and then we also see Thomas Sharp trying to create a machine to mine clay. Both of them are reaching for tools of the industrial area, tools of the more industrial era, and both of them, in a way, are sort of reaching for modernity that they don't have in their current like space. But the thing is that like when they go back to England, when after Carter is dead, and when Thomas brings her back to Cumberland, they are in essence going back in time. America is used as a shorthand for a more modern era that's moving forward despite its lack of machinery. But the thing is that as soon as they go back to Ollerdale Hall, in Cumberland in England, apart from the fact that they're so socially isolated, they are in essence going back in time. They're going back to a place where those social mores are a lot more restrictive and a lot more hard placed. I mean, people find that in the UK and in England, particularly today, coming from the US in terms of class divisions. And the thing is that, like, in the past talk, one of the things that Camilla was talking about in terms of character design was the cycle of trauma, right? And the thing is that one of the things that many traumatized people do is we repeatedly go back to things that we feel secure in, not necessarily good in, not necessarily healthy in, and not necessarily the things that are best for us, but we go back to people, to places, to sort of systems of power that make us feel like we know what the rules are. And subsequently, and not in a victim blamey way, but in a way that often primes recipients of abuse for further abuse that mirrors abuses they've experienced in the past. And this is what Thomas does. When he takes Edith back to England, as he's done with his other wives, when he brings her back to Ollerdale Hall, he is returning to the cycle of abuse he experienced as a child. And while he isn't doing the same abuse on his wives as his father did on his mother, there is a cycle of violence there. And there is a continuous sort of cycle of devouring and being devoured. In the characters of Edith and Lucille, we see an exploration of natural law and decay. In Edith's conversation with Lucille, when they're initially talking about butterflies, when we then go back to the house and they're talking about the tea that they're giving Edith to poison her, and she says it's bitter, it doesn't taste good. And Thomas says, things have to be bitter here in order to survive. If you don't have a bit of bitterness to you, the things around you will consume you. And this is what we see with Lucille and with Thomas. And implicitly, the people that have been brought there, because they've been brought from other places, and because they've been brought there not to manage, not to have been brought in that environment and not have grown in that social environment as much as that like physical environment, which is dire because it's fucking cold and damp and nothing is there. You even the outside on the dales, you don't see green, it's just gray. That is a difficult place to survive, and you have to work to survive, and you have to cannibalize others to survive. It is standard UK housing. Yeah, I will say for Crimson Peak, for all that clay, the mold couldn't survive, so it's probably quite luxury compared to a lot of places we might live in. But yeah, so like when Edith is brought back, she's entering into that space, into a space where suddenly like she has to you know, like cannibalize things to survive. And with the ghosts, these are things that have already died and therefore are outside of that cycle. But Edith doesn't know that. She's frightened of the ghosts feeding on her, but they're the only thing that can't eat. They have already decayed. They have already left that cycle. The people that she has to be worried about are Thomas, are Lucille, are other things that are alive in order to eat things because they have a hunger. The deaf don't have a hunger anymore for anything. All they have is their communication. And what's fascinating is that like you then see her when she's like grabbing hold of her paw later in the play, is when she then grabs hold of that pen. She could sign her life away with the pen by signing the contract to give back to Lucille, and therefore sign her money away, be fully cannibalized, and instead she uses it as a weapon. In the way that like a lot of like phallic tools are used as weapons, whether it's as pens in order to express themselves, or whether it's like physically grabbing like a knife or another like phallic metaphor for paw. But she kills Lucille, and she attacks Lucille, and then obviously like Lucille breaks, and like she consistently has paw. She has the keys, which Edith asks for, which are her right as the lady of the house, and Edith point blank refuses her, but she then steals one of the keys in order to give her power over the household, unlocking one of the things which like phallic stuff, blah blah blah, but also like in unlocking that trunk, and then Enola Ciotti also seems to unlock a cupboard for her without a key. And the ghosts are giving her a power over the house that she wouldn't be able to have because she's denied like the physical power over the house. But the ghosts are helping her have that because again, they don't have like a role in that power anymore. They want to disrupt the cycle that's at play. They want to get her out of it as they couldn't escape themselves whilst living. And also with Lucille, because she's constantly killing people, as you do. But in her, in using blunt force as a weapon, in killing men, in killing women with blades or with poison, she's using a variety of weapons. She's evolving to survive in these spaces. In that she says moths feed on butterflies, and all of these butterflies that Thomas has brought home, these wives that he's had, have come home, have been sort of forced to enter a chrysalis by being poisoned, where they're constantly asleep and not really fully aware of what's going on around them until they're finally put into clay in the way that like a moth might be surrounded by the pupae that Edith cuts them out of, where they transform into these specters that then don't have power over anything, but can only communicate, can only warn, and can only haunt, rather than being part of that system of nature anymore. One of the things that Crimson Peak does very well is pastiche. Obviously, like it references a lot of horror films that, like, because I noticed on the Wikipedia it mentions like the horror films that it references. The Haunting, 1963, which is a great sort of lesbian piece of film. If you haven't seen it, it's fantastic. There's obviously like The Shining. A lot of like classic horror films are referenced in the piece. What isn't talked about as much on Wikipedia is the extent to which it takes reference from other Gothic horror. Obviously, like it's a house in the middle of these dales, and like this is like a staple of the Gothic. Like we've got a lot of this wonderful sweeping Gothic architecture, these beautiful pieces of stained glass, these high ceilings, these vaulting ceilings, this house that is maze-like and labyrinthine, the shadows in it, the use of color. But we also have, for example, like Finlay. When we see him, he's obviously an example. He parallels Joseph in Wuthering Heights, a sort of like apparently confused and doddering elderly caretaker who's outside of the house and knows a lot more about what is going on inside the house than like people feel that he should, because he doesn't know not to reveal that he knows things, because he's confused and he's sort of exited the social expectation because he's so old and because he's been there for so long and because they're isolated and they don't have their choice of servants. You see Edith references, Edith is compared to Mary Shelley, where people compare her to Mary Shelley, and she sort of says that she'd rather be widowed than a spinster. You see when they go to the house and the fact that he's had these other wives, that's obviously like a staple in a lot of Gothic literature, but is a reference to Jane Eyre, in that they used to be, these wives are being kept up in the attic. Even when you go up into the attic and they see the old wheelchair that the mother used to use, right? Which is, present in Jane Eyre as well. And also the fact that like Lucille was a victim of the asylum and was made to go to these asylums. And even the fact that Lucille, pardon me, takes trophies of hair from her victims and carefully braids them. And we know from the history of asylums and the way that they would be used by wig makers, that I imagine that she got her hair cut in that way to be sold onto wig makers, and would have seen other women have their hair cut, not for the same trophy, but these are the sort of things that, like, as I say, when you're young and when you're impressionable, the imprints that traumas make on you are cycles that you feel compelled to repeat. These are things that you get stuck in. These are things that yes. Sorry, you're saying about Edith among the clay pits. You're strongly reminded of H.P. Lovecraft's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, and those pits in which there was nothing but the liveliest awfulness in those that he had gathered only a part of. God, yeah. And especially in that Thomas, in his desperation, he's trying to dig his family out of a metaphorical hole, right? He's trying to dig into that clay in order to get like the money that clay is worth. The more he digs, the more that house and therefore his family sinks. In digging the hole, all he's doing is getting them deeper. All he's doing is digging them as a grave. But he thinks that if he just mechanizes the process and makes it faster, if he can make it fast enough, he can dig faster than they can sink. And it's not true. In a way, they are already dead. In a way, they are already buried and already decaying in those clay pits because of this cycle, right? And yeah, like where we see all these references to other horrors and also other elements of the Gothic and other elements of Gothic romance, we see these cycles. Now, a thing that is interesting about the way in which Edith is compared to other Gothic authors, she's compared obviously to Mary Shelley. We might talk about the way that when people talk about Frankenstein or a modern Prometheus, often people want to ascribe certain aspects of the text to Percy Shelley over Mary Shelley. Now, we know, as people who have an interest in the Gothic, that Percy Shelley was, I'm sure, in many ways a nice man, but he was also very wet, and not just because he had a fetish for drowned. The things that people want to ascribe to Percy Shelley over Mary Shelley are often to do with their assumptions of gender. And we know that Mary Shelley, in many ways, was a butch queen. She loved aspects of violence that people automatically assume can't have been hers and must have been about Byron, or must have been about Shelley, or must have been about any man that stood next to her for a period of time, because Mary Shelley was a weak woman. A woman that wanted to fuck on her mother's grave. A woman who you know, defined proto-feminism, and yet people want to define Mary Shelley by sort of like men that were in her shadow. And the thing is that, like, she still used her own name, and obviously, like, in someone remind me of the name of the semi-autobiographical text, the play about her uncle, about the Sam. Do you know the one that I mean? The other thing that Mary Shelley wrote, not Frankenstein.
Last Man?
No, not The Last Man. The title is might be a woman's name. Sorry, I'm just gonna Google this really quickly. I should have written this down.
Matilda.
Mary Shelley. Matilda, yes. The Mary Shelley play. Autobiographical. Sorry. Matilda, yes. Matilda, Papa, yes. You know the one I mean. Yes, sorry. But yeah, which is in large part about ways in which women are marginalized, right? And power over women. The ways in which you're allowed and allotted power, especially within the patriarchal familial framework, and the ways in which this is impacted by marriage, by the physical power and the economic power that this gives people over you, but also the ways in which this goes unsaid. Because a lot of Gothic literature, as I said earlier, is defined by these tumultuous and macabre emotions. And one of the things that I think is scary and difficult to understand about horror, but especially about like the Gothic, is that in many ways, there's a sadomasochistic desire for these horrible things to happen to you. For a lot of trauma victims, a weird thing that we can feel, a thing that feels like it's the opposite of what we should feel, is we feel a desire that something horrible would happen to us. For example, like when you go through a very traumatic childhood, but it's not something that you can explore explicitly. And when it's stuff like neglect, when it's stuff like physical neglect, not being touched, emotional neglect, isolation, you might grow up and be like, I wish a car crash would happen to me, or I wish someone would try and shoot me. I wish someone would do violence on me, because then the amount of emotions that I'm feeling inside and the horrible things I want would make sense. They would be justified, because the things that I've experienced haven't been violent, and therefore the extent of the emotion that I'm feeling isn't justifiable. And we see this in the Gothic. we see that people's desire for the macabre and the tumultuous and the horror, people's desire to be haunted, people's desire for death, which isn't just about a desire to die and for things to stop, but which is about a desire for something greater and worse and more traumatic, and about these cycles of abuse. And people think, well, nothing bad enough has happened to me that can justify this. For women particularly, there's a sense that, like, you can either be completely hysterical and faint and scream, after which you might be locked away for a period of time, so be careful, and after which you won't have the power you previously did, because you can either choose to express those emotions and be put away for it, or you can keep those feelings inside, in which case they will torture you. And in which case you start seeing ghosts, and the thing becomes like delusions, right? And like these threats or these diagnoses of hysteria that come from all these feelings inside that can't be outwardly expressed. And even shit like, you know, sexual abuse by doctors of women that came to be about like getting orgasms from them, which is in a way a release, right? But the thing is that when we look at the period and when we look at Gothic literature and the ways in which, for example, the Brontes, Charlotte Bronte and Emily Bronte, felt compelled to use pseudonyms. We see the same for Middlemarch, for George. Like, that was obviously also like an element of trans masculinity and gender stuff going on there. But like, regardless of the extent to which it's related to potential trans masculinity or butchness in lesbian and queer identity, a thing that people are experiencing is that they have to some extent, show a male or masculine identity in order for their feelings in text and the things that they're writing to be taken as they are written, to not be dismissed as just a silly ghost story, to not be just dismissed as silly women's writing, but instead to be explored as the tumultuous and dark feelings that they explore to the depth. When people talk about Jane Eyre, the first thing that people complain to me about is that Jane Eyre is stupid. Jane Eyre makes bad decisions. Why did she stay with him? And it's like, well, Jane Eyre made a choice. Jane Eyre's choice was about a society in which the whole world is out to torture her and will torture her and is allowed to torture her because she is a woman. And here she finds a man who wants to be tortured the way that she wants to torture and will torture her in turn. But it's about making a choice where she has a certain level of power over their relationship. She gets to decide, to some extent, how that torture is happening, and by God, it'll be a two-way torture, and he's cool with that. He's not going to lock her up because he's already got a wife in the attic, and that gives her leverage. There is a level of mutualism, yes, that is present in that relationship that by definition can't be, yes, and disability, and the way that chronic illness defines these things, because we also see this in Crimson Peak, right? We also see that once their mother was disabled, then they had power over her, and then they were able to wrest control from their mother, whose power over them was situational as a woman, but then as a disabled woman trapped in the house. And even Thomas's first wife, it's no coincidence that the first wife that he gets is another woman that is disabled and uses a wheelchair. The first one that they go for in bringing to this cycle most resembles their mother. But yeah, so the thing about these things is that you have this perceived frivolity of female emotion. And that's why people use pseudonyms, and why did people like dismiss things by women written by women, and but why there was a fear also of women reading these texts and therefore making bad decisions, right? People don't want women to read Jane Eyre and think, oh, this is the right way to act. You should be seeking out this scary Byronic hero who's oh so sexy. And like the ways in which he's sexy are like wrong, because he's not doing the proper social things. In the same way that Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, in the way that he's racialized as a Romani man, but also in the fact that he's dirty and he's poor. Later he gets money, but that isn't enough, because you still remember that he was dirty and he was poor. And you still remember that he isn't born into this in the way that the men that you should want are. I mean, even fucking Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice is a prick. And yes, he's got autism, but like Darcy's incorrect stuff and the way in which like he resembles a lot of like these Byronic things by being distant and being like dark and broody, is in part because like he has to learn to express his feelings, right? And that becomes like a level of mutualism as well. And what I wanted to link that with this talk is now, where we don't have Victorian conservatism telling us about like the ways in which are appropriate to express our feelings, and we're allowed to express our feelings a lot more. However, people are expected, because of social media and because of a sense of consistent surveillance, we are expected to feel feelings, but those feelings are constantly being surveilled, and there's a constant pressure to feel the right feelings and perform the right feelings. And this carries to literature, literature and film and television. I think that if Crimson Peak came out today, it's been less than 10 years since this movie came out. A lot has changed in our society, partly because of technological advances, partly because we're in a new recession, partly because of a lot of right-wing sort of fascist growth in those 9 years. People's responses to literature have changed a lot. Media literacy for many people is at an all-time low. English classes are being defunded, history is being defunded. Oh, I wrote another essay that I will link about harmful fiction and problematic fiction, which is linked to this thesis statement that I'm presenting to you here. But media literacy is at an all-time low, and there is a deep fear of dark and scary feelings in television, in film, in pornography, in erotica, in literature. Because if you feel something and it's a bad feeling, it's the wrong feeling, you immediately have to condemn it. That's the one. Thank you very much. You have to condemn it. You have to condemn these bad feelings that you're feeling. And there was, to some extent, a pressure to do that when we were looking at, like, for example, like people do it about Jane Eyre, but like Wuthering Heights is Stephenie Meyer's favorite book and was one of the inspirations for Twilight. Now, when we read Twilight, and I can criticize Twilight until the cows come home. It's very poorly written. It's very Mormon. It's very racist. But the thing that people most criticize about Twilight is that teenage girls like it. Their problem isn't the racism. Their problem isn't Stephenie Meyer's religious conservatism and white supremacy. Their problems aren't to do with like the poor writing in the text. It is to do with the fact that teenage girls like it. And why do teenage girls like it? Because they're stupid. Because teenage girls want to be raped. They want a creepy man to look in their window, and we have to teach them that that's the wrong thing. Because these teenage girls will read the wrong books and then they'll do the wrong thing, and then anything bad that happens to them will be their fault because they felt the wrong feelings. And we know that if you feel the wrong feelings, then bad things happen to you. And those bad things happen to you because you felt bad things, and you therefore deserve those bad things happening to you. Now, when we have any element of media literacy, we're able to explore the dark and complex feelings that a piece of media might make us feel, or the bad things that happen in that piece of media. And because of the surveillance state that we live in, and because of social media, there is a sense of when you consume bad media, you have to condemn it. We see this in, I don't know how online everyone is. There are some people that define themselves as antis, and they define themselves as against pro-shippers, which is an online cult. There is a link to an essay about the cultist aspect to this in that harmful fiction essay at the top. But these are many of them young and impressionable people. Many of them are teenagers or young people. And many of them will at the same time, for example, engage with media like Game of Thrones, NBC Hannibal, the new Game of Thrones sequel, House of the Dragon. And they will say, bad things happen in this. And you have to enjoy these television shows in the correct way, by which they mean you have to watch it and the whole time shake your head and think, well, I think incest is bad. I think he shouldn't have raped that woman. I think it's probably bad that that woman financially abused that man. Oh, it's very bad. You're not allowed to enjoy it. And the way in which you enjoy it means you can only enjoy the good things, and the people doing good and cool and empowering things, women in doing, especially women doing cool and empowering things, because this is a way that feminist thought has been twisted into the correct performance of like girl boss. I mean, we could say the same about the fucking Barbie film, which, to be fair, is a bit of a departure from the Gothic, so I won't go into that right now. But the thing is that like this has become twisted into, I have to enjoy this movie because the women are doing the correct thing and they're being empowered. Oh, the Malibu Gothic. But the women are being twisted and they're being empowered. But that means that if you write something like Crimson Peak, something like, or something worse than Crimson Peak, something like Wuthering Heights, something like Jane Eyre, where the ending is bad, where people make bad decisions, where the ending is bittersweet, or where the ending is just fucked up, people go, oh, but because it didn't tell us the good thing at the end, that's bad. And therefore, we don't get something like the Gothic. Every feeling and every idea has to be explicitly stated so that we know that the author is doing a good thing and writing a good thing. And this is the same in that, like, to bring this fully back to it about genre and about genre classification, Gothic horror and Gothic romance, particularly Gothic romance, is mislabeled as horror. And it's not as simple as horror, but people never want to put Gothic romance in the romance section because it's bad. Because romance is meant to be about good things that you want to happen to you. And what happens to you in Gothic romance is too complex for you to actually admit that you want aspects of the Gothic. That's why Twilight is dismissed. That's why Twilight is silly and for teenage girls, and people should grow out of it because they want a dark thing and they're meant to grow out of wanting dark things or thinking they might want dark things. You're meant to not want those things, and you're meant to say that you not want those things, or otherwise you deserve them to happen to you. And similarly, we have a generation of people, and many people, there's nothing wrong with reading YA before I say this, there's nothing wrong with YA, but many people only want to read YA and the young adult genre has been stretched to people in their mid 20s, and people want stuff that has a YA feel or a YA flavor, even when it's for adult fiction and contemporary fiction, because there's a sense that YA stuff, because it's still for kids or still for teenagers and young people, amplifies the good feelings. And it's not just that people don't want to grow up. It's not just a fear of growing up and not being infantilized. It's also, in our increasingly fascist society with a lack of media literacy, it's people not wanting to be seen doing the wrong thing and feeling the wrong feelings. You're not allowed to read a book and decide for yourself, I have complicated feelings about this, I want to sit with them, and I want to feel the bad feelings and the good feelings. You have to go to CinemaSins or any other essay that tells you what the good things are and tells you what the bad things are, and prescribe to you the correct moral judgment to take away from these texts. And that's easiest in what people perceive to be YA, either because it's queer, and therefore because it's queer or written by women or written by people who aren't white, and therefore is left-wing or liberal because of people's association with those identities. Therefore, it must be YA. Therefore, it must be simple. Therefore, it must tell you the right feelings, because you do the feelings by doing. I know that this is complicated the way that I'm saying it, and I think it would have been easier if I had slides rather than saying it, but you get what I mean, right? Fascism is bad, media literacy is good. I'm done. Watch Crimson Peak.
Wait, is that the end? Okay.
I think so, yeah.